time. So my name is Hector Linares. I'm a program manager with the Virtual Machine Manager team. That's part of the System Center suite of products to manage Windows in the enterprise. I've got Alex Napuro with me, and he's a developer on the team. There we go. He's a developer on the team that's been working on the SMIS our SMIS work with partners on managing NAS devices, so non-Windows devices that implement SMB3. Right? And so we've also been engaged with SNIA and to get the profiles sufficient enough so that we can use them for account management, discovery, end-to-end mapping, and a bunch of the features that we have in BMM. So I want to start off first with, let me bring this up a little bit here. Level set of what System Center can do. So from a System Center perspective, there's multiple components that I want to quickly touch on. So I'm going to build this slide deck really quickly here. So System Center and the new version 2012 that released this year is primarily focused on cloud-based, private cloud-based deployments of Windows Server and also cross-management with VMware and also Zen Server. And the cross-management capabilities apply both on the fabric side of being able to build up storage, compute, networking, also getting into the self-service workflow orchestration, cloud and private cloud capacity and delegation, and also when it comes to hosters and what are called the service providers or the hosters. And so this is a full landscape of the different components within System Center, starting on the right-hand most side here, left hand, with the application owner. So there's a big life cycle around the application and the applications in the environment, the owners of those applications. Moving through the stack, you get into what's called the service model or the application model. 3-tier applications that can be modeled inside of System Center, deployed, managed, serviced as well. And you get monitoring, reporting, capacity utilization. A lot of the features in System Center apply at the application level and also on the fabric side when it comes to compute, storage, and networking. You get into, there's a product that we purchased a few years ago called, I even forgot the name now. It's called Orchestrator now. Basically, it's workflow automation. And so you go from the service model to the end-to-end workflows that can deploy these applications. Then you get into components like Virtual Machine Manager that actually can deploy multiple VMs in a service configuration into the environment. And that can be for VMware, Hyper-V, or Zen Server. Operations Manager is a monitoring tool that actually will go off and give you discovery, alerts, monitoring, any threshold alerting as well on those applications, also for the physical resources. For the backup capabilities, there's Data Protection Manager, actually taking those applications, backing them up locally or to the cloud. Some new features in System Center allow you to do backup to the cloud. And then finally, Service Manager, which actually gives you the whole IT process management around the services, not only service acquisition, service deployment, management, and also decommissioning. So that's the full view of System Center. There's a lot of components in here that are primarily focused on the enterprise, moving into the hoster space, and also service providers. Windows Server 2012 obviously opens up that list of customers as well, since the big focus on actually service providers and hosters. All right, so from a VMM, Virtual Machine Manager perspective, we're going to drop down all the way to the fabric side. So on the fabric level, talking compute, storage, and networking, this presentation is primarily around the file server work that we've done for both Windows file servers and NAS, NAS devices that implement SMB3. But to give you a high-level overview of the 4 pillars inside of VMM, when we went off and invested in a product, there's infrastructure investments we've done with being able to give VMM the scalability, reliability, allow it to be automated, so automatable. So you've got 438 commandlets in RTM, and that number is increasing with our new version that syncs up with Windows Server 2012. When you get to the fabric side, The key investments here, the new investments for VMM around server lifecycle management, ability to deploy from bare metal a physical Hyper-V machine, multiple hypervisors, network management, the ability to create a logical network on top of your environment, so production, backup, extranet, intranet, whatever the customer will end up consuming is what you can make a logical network out of in VMM. We've done several similar things for storage, so you can actually deploy to gold, silver, bronze, any kind of SLA or performance guarantee. That's what you get in storage management in VMM. Not only the ability to deploy to a particular classification, but also provision. So we do LUN provisioning, snapshot, cloning, masking, and unmasking. We'll bring that same level of investment to file servers as well. Discovery of file servers, discovery of shares, creation of shares, deletion of shares, modifying of ACLs, removing and adding of ACLs. Again, this investment is around the ease of use of storage in a Hyper-V environment. And finally, dynamic optimization, being able to deploy hundreds and thousands of VMs into an environment and then have VMM over time load balance and give you the right use of that environment. A big investment aside from Fabric has been cloud, so that's a new area for VMM. What we call clouds or private clouds. Go ahead.
So this product, is it separate from the storage management? So a lot of the features you're talking about are generic. They apply to any workload.
Correct.
HPC, database, whatever, ACLs, management.
Mm-hmm.
So is this tool separate from those other components?
So this is one component within System Center, primarily focused on virtual machine management. So even though what I'm talking about here, especially around storage, is generic to any workload, this one in particular, the application that we focus on is Hyper-V.
Okay, so there's a separate management ScreenFlow and PowerShell commandlets for managing Hyper-V storage and managing any other workload storage?
So before Windows 8, there was really no other engine that did the workflows that VMM does. With Windows Server 2012, there's 85 commandlets in the platform that VMM now takes advantage of. So we are a subset of what Windows Server can do. With the difference is that we optimize workflows end to end. So for example, when we create a LUN and unmask it to a host, we actually validate that it's been unmasked. We initialize a disk, create a partition, format the volume, create the cluster resource, do whatever we need to do. In Windows, you get the primitives, and you have to stitch them together.
And this is an extra cost item, right? Above, let's see, like if you go to the MSDN today, you see, release candidate came out last week or 2 weeks ago for Windows 2012 Data Center. Mm-hmm. This isn't part of Data Center; it's a separate product.
Correct. So System Center is a different product altogether that does not ship in box with Windows. There's one. It's one license, so most customers buy one or two pieces, or use one or two or three pieces of it. But when they buy System Center, they get the entire thing. So they get to pick and choose what they want to use. So what I'm going to focus on though is the storage investments we've made on the NAS side, and that is generic. That we happen to use this for VMs and Hyper-V, but it's something that any third party, any client, any hoster, or anybody else can actually build on themselves and leverage. So quickly to wrap up on clouds. Clouds is the ability for VMM to take capacity and delegate it to an end user. So by an end user, I mean an application user. If they need to use some amount of CPU, some amount of memory, but you don't want to give them the actual visibility into the fabric, what clusters, what hosts, where to deploy, what region they're in, or whatever, clouds actually give you that abstraction level. So IT admins can delegate clouds to users. They can grow their environment separately from that. So it gives them that nice decoupling. And finally, services, or what are really applications, is the VMM model of deploying a multi-tier application. So Link, SharePoint, CRM, anything that requires, for example, web, line of business, and database tier can be modeled in System Center, deployed, managed, and serviced all through VMM. And obviously, System Center adds all the value out on top of that, but primarily for VMM, you've got those capabilities. So when it comes to storage management and storage automation, when we went out a few years ago and talked to our customers and asked them what are the biggest pain points, and this is applicable to block and file. Obviously, before Windows Server 2012, it was really just a block issue, but it applies to file as well now. Customers came back and said, number one, I've got no visibility. I simply do not understand how my VMs or my workloads relate to the underlying storage. I don't have the tools or anything along the lines to just give me that picture, that mental map. Some people in my organization might have it, I don't. Right? If it's a smaller company where the one guy that does storage also does networking and compute, obviously problem solved. That's not every case, especially when you get to larger enterprises. These are silos of groups that don't necessarily talk to each other. So that's one pain point. Second, once you actually get to the particular workload here that we're talking about, VMs, there's no way of mapping VMs to the underlying storage. There's no way of saying, I have this virtual machine with a particular virtual disk on this host disk or host volume, host disk. Now give me the LUN. Help me understand how this disk and this array are related. Right? So there's no way of mapping end to end. Typically, customers create Visio diagrams, drawings on the board, mental pictures, tribal knowledge of how everything is connected. But the minute you do that, it's already outdated, right? So they constantly have to churn this, and they usually get it wrong because it's very fluid. Last one, when I have an issue and I have to call out my storage guy. First of all, I have to get on a call with 20 people and figure out whose problem is it. Once we have identified it's a storage problem, I don't know how to talk to that storage person in their language, i.e. the LUN information, what array they're on, what pool they're using, anything along the lines of how the storage admin thinks of their world. We get the similar feedback from our partners in their own UIs, in their own management tools. They've got, for example, switches or SANs. They don't know how their SANs or switches, let's say fiber channel switches or network switches, relate to VMs. Because they get a call about a VM on a particular virtual NIC and this MAC, and they don't exactly know where it's coming from. They just happen to know it's on a particular port, but they don't know how the topology lays out. So this problem gets worse once you get into private clouds. So there's a very big push on Microsoft on the private cloud abstractions and the private cloud investments, both on-premise for customers and also going off to hosters and their hosted clouds and eventually into Azure, right? A lot of this gets decoupled between fabric and cloud, and then the separation gets bigger. So in the clouds, for example, in VMM, you actually create them from computers, Hyper-V servers, storage, and networking. You know, on the one side, you've got the logical topology of how those hosts and clusters are laid out, how storage is assigned to them. On the other side, you've got the users and their quotas. So something has to bring this all together. Something has to put this all in context for at least one person to be able to see it end to end. So the other set of investments that we went out as far as, from pain points, one is discovery and visibility and mapping. How do I make sense of it all? Once you've discovered everything, customers were telling us, listen, I spend way too much time waiting for storage to be provisioned. If you want me to adopt this private cloud model, it takes me too long. I don't want to wait 2 weeks to get storage capacity. We also asked them, well, if you don't want to wait, why don't you automate? So of the 250 TAP respondents, 86% came back and said they can't do automation either, or 50% said, I don't have the expertise. I just simply have not hired the right people. I don't have that level of API knowledge or scripting knowledge inside of my environment, or the ability to do end-to-end workflows that are this advanced. The other half said, you know what, there's just too many APIs. I've got EMC, NetApp, IBM, I've got way too many of them out there. If I do one thing, I'll do it across all of them, but then I don't get anything. That, or I automate for one, and I still have the problem of inconsistency. And the 14% that actually went as far as doing this automation, they were just looking for how to reduce human error, how to reduce the fat fingering of a zone or of a particular name or something that always cause problems, always cause issues. So that's what we went after. We said, all right, how do we solve the discovery end-to-end mapping problem? How do we solve the automation problem? We can't solve CapEx, right? VMM cannot change the cost of storage for a customer. We can't change management storage. We can make it easier to manage. We can make it seamless. We can make it easier to manage. And that is really what we went after. So to give a little bit of history, we said, well, what can VMM do? What interfaces can VMM use to get to storage? The two options we had were VDS, hardware providers, and also SMIS. Now we're talking about 3 years ago, 2008, 2009. This is the kind of feedback we got about SMIS when we started probing and asking. Customers, industry, partners, there was a lot of feedback and perception issues about SMIS. Most of these, actually all of them, have been proven not to be true, but at that point in time, this is the feedback we got. Whether number one, SMIS is dead, no one has SMIS providers. For some RFCs, SMIS became a checkbox. Does your device support SMIS? But the customer, the end customer, the Bank of America or the Merrill or whoever, they're not actually going to use this thing. They just needed a checkbox. From the partner side, we got the feedback, well, SMIS is just way too difficult to implement. There's too much of it. There's 1,000 pages, 8 books is just way too much. The other feedback is that SMIS makes all arrays look the same. So, that's what we got confronted with. And so we said, oh, you know what, SMIS is still our best option. We made a strategic investment in SMIS, and we went forward. So Microsoft has already started sending participants to the Plugfest. These are the SNIA, the SNIA, SMI Lab Plugfest in Colorado Springs. We've already had representatives there since like 2009, early 2010. And since 2011, the VMM team has been there all 5 of last year and the first 3 of this year. So the last 8 Plugfests we've been there. We started engaging with the different technical working groups within SMI. We started attending SDC and MDC, basically just getting ourselves out there. We made as part of this investment, we said, you know what, we're going to engage with 2 key partners to kick this off. That was EMC and NetApp. And shortly after, once we started to get the word out and get partners on board, a lot of other partners followed. So let me go back quickly to this. So turns out SMIS was definitely not dead. When we started scratching the surface, there's a lot of providers that actually had SMIS. Some of them just didn't want to talk about it. Others just said, we have it, we just haven't used it. So have at it. And the checkbox, I think, was a good thing for some customers to ask, except there was no client. I think that was probably the biggest issue that we had with SMIS. There's really no client driving a lot of the requirements. The only ones that were out there were performance clients, getting monitoring and performance data, not configuration. The difficulty to implement was easily overcome by us producing a requirements document that said, this is the subset of SMIS that we care about. That actually put a lot of things into context for our partners and said, it's not 8 books, it's actually these specific profiles, these specific properties. The value add was definitely didn't go anywhere, because if the storage device is advanced in provisioning and performance and whatever it is, the value add is going to be there, regardless of what what interface calls into it. So, what experience did we have with SMIS? Now we're talking after the initial engagement, getting an understanding of what's out there, and then engaging with partners and driving the development of the providers forward. Like I mentioned before, the lack of clients was probably our biggest issue. We were the only ones at these Plugfests actually driving new requirements. So that obviously needs to change over time. So far, we have been very successful in engaging with all partners, being at all these Plugfests, and actually getting some pretty good feedback and also some good responses from our partners. There was a lot of implementation issues. There's just the providers might have been great at the performance and the monitoring capabilities, but when it came to provisioning and for example, LUN provisioning discovery, there was a lot of issues with the implementation. There was missing properties, missing associations, and it turns out that CTP just wasn't enough. If we had said, listen, you pass CTP and work with Virtual Machine Manager or even Windows Server 2012, it's not enough. Actually, there's more things that we require to ensure that it works with the Microsoft products. When we started to turn on scale, so we got through functionality issues. We turned on scale, and pretty much every provider fell to the floor. And it either not reliable, not scalable, and those are the two, or not stable, right? Just those were the biggest issues we had with the providers. So we spent the last year and a half working with every partner, giving them a PowerShell test harness. So the PowerShell test harness we have today exercises all of our functionality, all of our scale, using VMM commandlets. Eventually, that'll translate to, back to your question, that'll translate to validation scripts that will run on Windows Server natively, that just check with the generic primitives that are available in Windows. And so basically to give every partner that ability to test. New providers were not being developed. So what we've seen in the past year and a half as new companies are engaging us, there's simply not enough guidance out there for new providers on how to implement their own provider, whether it's SIMOM issues or profile questions or whatever. That there's just not enough of that out there. So we've been working with several to get them through those initial hurdles. So what we've done with SMI, our activity with SMI, now this now starts talking more going into NAS. So we started with block. That's really our first initial engagement. That's where we pushed a lot of the partners as far as stability, reliability, implementation issues, et cetera. Then we knew we were going to go after NAS and Fabric. So this is why, again, SMI became a strategic investment for us. So with NAS management, we said we know SMB3 is coming down the road. We've obviously known that for years. Question is, how is VMM, or at least System Center, going to be ready to manage an environment with SMB3 out NAS devices? And what we quickly figured out is that ACL management was the biggest gap in that story. So with the NAS profiles that exist today, we can discover file servers, we could discover shares, and but the identity piece, either discovering the identity or setting an identity, was a complete gap. And so it just wasn't exercised at all. Yep.
So, two questions. In the NAS management piece, the other piece that there had been some standards activity about that it looked like kind of fell apart was global namespace management. And obviously that's a big part of NAS, right? Setting up, this refers to that. You've got a replica of the share over here, and that directory sits over, you've got the referrals set up. Is that part of the scope of this SMI NAS activity?
No. No, the global namespace is not.
Because that, I think of that as roughly the same level as ACLs in terms of complexity and the kinds of things.
We're not provisioning file servers in any way. We are leaving that to the user. We're only dealing with provisioning file servers.
Yeah. So the question was whether we are looking at global namespaces for the scope of this, and the answer is no. And also, we're not looking at provisioning file servers in any way. So given an already provisioned file server with a block storage backing it, we are going to provision file shares on that.
The problem is, for virtualization, it's the most important use case, right? So I'll give you an example. You've got your virtual machines set up under some sort of root directory. These ones need to be replicated on multiple servers, these ones don't. So which servers they are for, you're talking about the bronze and silver and gold level of reliability, which ones are available on multiple hosts and which VMs don't really matter, and so they're only available on one host, is sort of part of your bronze, gold, silver certification of a...
So in your setup, who's actually doing the replication? The NAS device or the Hyper-V application?
Well, from the point of view of global namespace, it doesn't matter. But from the point of view of SMB3, all we care about is that that thing over there matches that thing over there. So I can connect to either one for load balancing purposes, and how it's done underneath is transparent. So it could be done at the block level, it could be done at file system level, it could be a cluster file system. That's not the file server's responsibility to figure out. That's the file system's responsibility. But I mean, when you're connecting to it and you're trying to determine if there are multiple copies of this, let's say that server goes down, the witness protocol discovers that it's dead. And we want to know other servers that we can connect to, so we have this VFS namespace with replicas. The thing that it seems particularly useful for virtualization to be able to at least configure that, make it somebody else's problem to set up. Today, there are multiple ways to do this in Windows. You've got 2 different file replication protocols. You've got cluster file systems. You've got block replication. And from the point of view of NAS, they don't really care. The NAS protocols only care about, you've got a global namespace, and this share both show up when I try to access that directory.
Mm-hmm. Right. So from the work that we've done so far, it's been around ACL management, but the global namespace we haven't addressed. We've used the scope, or the boundary is the continuously available file cluster or NAS device, right? That has the continuous availability or high availability built in. So that's been the boundary. Outside of that, we have not addressed that.
And second question, when you talked on the previous slide about SMI, problems, the one that I had heard about the most was just that there's no security model that maps to NAS. So, Windows, you got Kerberos, you've got other alternatives as well, but it's very convenient. You've got Active Directory. So when you're trying to manage a set of NAS, it's very easy. You can define administrative roles quite easily. Now when you go to SMI, you've got a different security model, a different wire protocol, a different, it's not tied into RPC, it's not tied into LDAP, it's not tied into any of the traditional ways. So security doesn't work. And so now you're trying to manage ACLs, but you're not using Kerberos. How do you work around that problem?
So from the SMI perspective, from a management perspective, we set the question is, from a security perspective, SMI doesn't have much in it with regards to integration with Kerberos and all the other security domains out there that you would already have natively with NAS. So the question is, with VMM and SMI, how are we addressing the gap, basically, between those two? So from a management perspective of us setting ACLs, we're using the identities that are available through AD. So we're not using SMI as an authorization check into the share, obviously. We're just setting the ACLs so that the clients, in this case the Hyper-V servers, that need to access that share, are actually ACLed or permissioned on that share. So if the NAS device does integrate with AD, and we've got a few of those that do, we would be using those identities.
So can we think of an example? So an example, okay, let's say this was a Windows box, or let's say that guy's got a Windows box over there. So he's bringing up your tool, and over there sits a NetApp filer. Now he's a member of an Active Directory domain, and the NetApp filer may be a member of the Active Directory domain. When he goes to a Windows server over there, presumably, is he using a different wire protocol for that management flow over SMI than he does to NetApp? Because over NetApp, he's not using the same user as he would for Active Directory.
So from an SMIS perspective, we connect to we connect to a provider first. So VMM has credentials to log into an SMIS provider. That's a proxy provider in the NetApp case.
Oh, so you're saying that you're not actually connecting to NetApp server?
No.
Oh.
Everything is indirect. Everything is through a proxy, or at least a provider, whether it's embedded or proxied.
Okay, so this is the $1,000,000 question, right? Is that no one wants to do that, right? Because that means you got to go install in every workstation that could potentially ever have to admin a proxy.
No, it's remote. In this case, the recommendation is one remote proxy.
But I mean, he has to have the proxy running on his system,
from a VMM perspective. Hold on, let me just draw this here. I don't have that architecture diagram. So the VMM server process sitting on a Windows Server machine. You have clients connecting to this. So this is, for example, the UI console can connect from any machine remotely. This is WCF, Windows Communication Foundation.
And that's Kerberos.
That would be using Windows credentials. Yes. So this is whatever the user is logged in as. So for example, Hector, in Windows domain, for whatever, right? So that's my credentials going into this box. This box talking out to the SMIS proxy. So from here, we've got a storage service, and we're talking SymXML to this SMIS provider, and the credentials we're passing along there could be local, maybe it could be domain account. But in that case, it's not Kerberos. I mean, what would we be using there?
We use HTTPS.
Yeah. So basically, HTTP and HTTPS are the two ways that we connect to these providers.
Well, I mean, if this were a Windows provider on the right-hand side, would you use the same credentials?
SMS can do WMI as well.
So the perfect world, everybody's doing WMI, right?
It depends on who you're asking. Yes.
Well, I mean, I'd like, we're talking about managing ACLs. I get nervous. So I would like, the common model everywhere, the common security model everywhere.
All right. So for the WMI-based providers, we would be connecting using Windows infrastructure as far as security is concerned.
So that list, the WMI list, is a separate document, and I'll talk about that later. But it's one of those things we've bounced around with Samba quite a bit. Is what would it take for Samba to support some of that? Because obviously, it's easier for us when we're thinking about managing shares and managing things to use the same security context that you are on the left-hand side of the picture when you're managing the right-hand side of the picture.
Understood. In the VMM world, though, this is always going to be a trusted subsystem. So you're going to have a separate set of credentials logging into this. So when we connect to a Windows file server, so this is a Windows 8 file server, we've got a credential here that we use to log in, and we use CredSSP for that, to actually be able to do the remote login to that box, and then do the discovery of shares and everything else we need. So we're using WMI with fresh credentials.
Anyway, it's just very hard to think about what that means for managing ACLs when the guy on the left-hand side has specific privileges in a specific domain, and the
But
guy
remember,
on the right.
the ACLs that we care about are not his or hers on the UI side. The admin logging into VMM, those are not the credentials that we're going to set on that share. What we're basically saying is that this file server and this share, these two need to be connected. So the Hyper-V server could be, like a server 08. That's the host name. There's a machine account associated to that in AD, right? So you've got your domain / machine account. That is basically what we would ACL here. We would not be managing the user's ACL on this share, because the user, the client in this case, is the application, which is Hyper-V, on this particular Windows server needing to access this share. The other ACL that we manage is the VMM account that we use to manage the file server. So those are the two accounts that we care about. So if there's 64 servers in the cluster, the accounts we'll be adding are the nodes 1 through 64 to this share.
Yeah, I mean, at some level it makes sense, but realize that the users are thinking about this in terms of domains, trees, forests. So those machine accounts they're very comfortable with. And they're very comfortable with which administrators are allowed to do what to those machine accounts, and backup privileges and backup operators, all the special quirks, group membership, and how to authorize particular people to do that. But this indirection makes it a little bit harder to imagine how you limit access. And the classic example is, okay, you got a Coke VM and a Pepsi VM, and you're trying to manage this in the cloud, and creating an admin, figuring out which machine accounts he's allowed to administer, and doing those types of operations are very routine. But this is an odd mapping.
Yeah. So the user logging in here is essentially a God account into VMM server. So that account would have access to storage, compute, networking, everything else, right? The delegation you're talking about are the private clouds that get created, again, inside of VMM. The admin has to create these clouds, and then an account can be used here, and so you can delegate or at least restrict user 1 only having access to blue VMs versus another cloud for red VMs.
So the Coke admin can only update his machine accounts, and the Pepsi can only update his machine accounts.
These accounts that can access the VMs are not the accounts here that can access the share. At the end of the day, it's Hyper-V accessing the share. It's not the user account, right? Because Hyper-V is running the process. So Hyper-V needs to be able to power on, power off the VMs. The user is already indirected anyway, right? Now, if you take us out of the picture and you only use a Hyper-V UI, then those credentials are impersonated. That's a different story, right? Then it becomes a problem, right? Because then that admin on the left-hand side has to be able to traverse all the way down to the Hyper-V side and to the file server to be able to modify ACLs and do all the work. In this case, that account is the VMM server account. So to get to the last piece of security for blue and red, that isolation happens way above the file server. We would never ACL Hector or user 1 to the file share directly or to a VM directly. The management of that alone is unsustainable, especially at hundreds of thousands of VMs. All right, so I'm pretty sure we'll have more questions as we move forward. Anyway, so ACL management was definitely the biggest gap there as far as how do we set those Hyper-V machine account ACLs on a share. We were missing identity, profiles, and everything else. We went after fabric management, so fiber channel zoning, fabric discovery, zone creation, zone deletion, adding members, deleting members. So that kind of work we actually completed at this last May Plugfest. And we're also working with our partners on supporting indications coming up from the array to the provider so that our cache is always kept up to date. All right, so I'm not going to go over these. I'm assuming the slides will be made available to you. But between this slide and the one that I presented at TechEd, you guys can go through this in more detail. But these are the 12 features of VMM from a storage management perspective. And some of these actually do apply to the file share. For example, being able to manage shares at the cluster level. Windows Server 2012 introduces support for 64 node clusters. So the alternative to VMM in the picture is having an admin going and adding every machine account to that share manually. VMM can do that all from an automated perspective through the UI or CLI. All the storage automation, all of our commandlets will work in in the file share case, whether it becomes file deployment, VM deployment, VM migration, or share creation, share deletion, discovery of shares, discovery of file servers. So a lot of these do apply in those cases. So to dig deeper into the architecture, the storage management API that Windows Server 2012 delivers is the API that VMM is taking a dependency on. Previous to Windows Server 8, we actually had to ship our own storage service. That service presents WMI to VMM. That's how we communicate to that service. That service is now part of Windows, and that's the service that sits here that talks SMIS down to the providers. The other piece of this API that we actually are taking advantage of is on the right-hand side, which is called pass-through. So the pass-through API gives us the ability to do what the core API on the left-hand side does not support. So NAS, Fabric, performance counters, anything that is not in the core 82 commandlets or 82 APIs, that's what we use for pass-through. This pass-through gives us the ability to get directly from this API down to the providers here. Okay, and so we still use SimXML as a way to get to those providers, but that's pretty much all we use. We don't leverage the cache that's part of this service. So System Center, File Server Manager, any third party can actually leverage those set of APIs. And so VMM isn't using anything proprietary in this case. We just did more work when it comes to NAS. So what you'll see in the 82 commandlets inside of Windows Server, there's nothing like create file share for as part of SM API. That's actually done through pass-through. So from an infrastructure perspective, you guys will have the slides for this. The key ones I want to point out for the providers that we do support, we do look for, like, for example, job control, indications profile, computer system, server profile. These are the core profiles we look for to be able to register a provider, register an array, and get all the information out of it. From the block storage side, there's a bunch of capabilities, profiles that we look for. The key ones are around the array profile, the storage virtualizer, block services, masking, unmasking, and copy services and replication services. But the rest of these are also important from the Windows perspective. For indication support, we didn't go after every indication out there. We did focus on the ones that are applicable to LUNs, capacity, masking, and unmasking. So these are the ones that we've been testing at the last 3 Plugfests. Around the key ones being the masking pieces here, right? Because basically what we want to guarantee is operational integrity. So if 10 LUNs exist, and tomorrow I want to unmask a LUN to a host, I want to make sure that LUN is actually available to be unmasked. Otherwise, it's going to fail. And then the customer is going to get some weird error. So this way, these indications keep our cache up to date, so the customer doesn't have to constantly update or constantly run discovery. All right. So for NAS, these are the profiles that we are looking at for NAS. The key one that Alex has been working on for the past 2 months with NetApp and EMC is on the simple identity management profile. That's actually where we're getting all the echoing work for identities and being able to do the associated privileges. But from a file export, so the file file server manipulation, and file system are the ones that give us discovery from the file server to the shares and the ability to create shares. Those are the core ones that we need. And then the performance is optional right now. We're not looking at performance, mostly discovery and provisioning. Any particular questions here before I dig into the identity piece on the profiles? Yeah.
When is this targeted for?
So the question is, when is the VMM support for NAS targeted for as far as release?
No, not your product. When is this SMI spec update targeted?
For identity, for the simple identity?
Well, I mean, these are all new profiles that are.
No, only the second one.
Oh, so all these are already part of SMI?
Book number 4, yeah.
When were they added?
8-0.
Probably 1.4.
1.3 had a bunch of them. 1.5 had all.
Roughly when was 1.5?
Last year?
So the
So, could you step the question and
Sure,
restate
so-
it? Thank you.
So the follow-up question was, in what version of SMI were these profiles available with? So some of them are 1.3, 1.4, but really 1.5 is the start of this. And when exactly they came out, I'm not sure, but it's been a few years.
One piece of this is not out yet.
Which is the piece that's not out. The question is, which piece of this is not available? Is the simple identity management profile, the updates we need for that in SMI to support the identity management or ACL management.
In particular, ACL. So will that support, obviously, Windows 2012, ACLs are different than Windows 2008. Claims-based access control. Does that support managing Windows 2012 ACLs?
So the question is, will this profile support the management of claims-based identity in Windows Server 2012?
Right.
So,
We're not doing anything particular for that.
so these are the AD
We're
credentials.
looking at 3 permissions. We're looking at read and execute, write, and change.
So what this looks like here, let me quickly. All right, so in the March Plugfest, we pretty much ironed out the majority of the implementation that we needed for NAS. By May, we actually got sign-off from partners on getting prototype implementations. The key piece that we need for simple identity actually sits within these 5 classes. Could you quickly explain what we've done here?
Yeah, so the central piece here is the identity, which is pretty much a token that represents a user. It's the equivalent of an SID in Windows. And then the way we actually get from a Windows logout, from an AD user to an identity, is by using the user contact class, which was meant in the original DMTF profile in 1034. It was meant exactly for that, for representing third-party logins. So there's an association class in between user content and identity, and we have a service class which is not represented here, the account management service, which actually handles all the management of user contacts. Because of the large number of users in an Active Directory domain, we had to put in some methods to actually create a user and get a user by username. So we could not rely on intrinsic for that. And then the account class for now we're not using. It actually represents a local user for that particular system. So it's got nothing to do with Active Directory. It's pretty much legacy. But it was in the profile, so we are representing it here. And then we also chose to not do anything for groups right now. So we are only setting explicit ACLs. We are not inheriting anything from groups. The reason being that all of the ACLs that we're going to set up through SCVMM are actually based in computer accounts.
So can you look up, let's say NFS style, user at domain? So you mentioned a mapping mechanism for mapping names. It sounds like you also, if you have Active Directory, would need to be able to map, the traditional sort of NFS style user at domain, so you can scope the user down to the security domain you're managing.
So what we actually do right now is we have one instance of an account management service per system, per computer. Now, that account management service doesn't have any capabilities associated to it, although the profile will allow it. So right now, it's a singleton. So to answer your question, in the future, you would be able to have an account management service instance that points to a capability instance referencing NFS. And the username is just a token. We chose to have Active Directory logins right now because that's what we were interested in. But there's absolutely nothing stopping you from having an NFS login. All right, so again, it is just a token that gets you to an identity, nothing more than that. So if by some mechanism you're able to go through to an account management service instance that supports whatever you're interested in, sure. And then from identity onwards, it's all standardized. Okay.
So I'm going to show some UI side of what all of this brings down to, from what this means from a VMM perspective, starting with discovery. And so the piece we talked about before is around the identity. That's the ACL management. But let's start at discovery again. So these are screenshots of the latest build of VMM. Basically, we need to connect first to a provider. So in this case, it's a NetApp provider that's running on a remote box. We're going to use HTTP in this case, so it's 5988. Of course, you can always use SSL. We will actually import the certificate, put it into the local store of the VMM server, not in the context of the user running the UI. And so once we import the certificate, if you're using SSL, we're going to need an account. So VMM does have a secure credential store. So this is just a NetApp with a password associated to it. You get all this into the UI, you hit next. So now VMM will go off and talk to the storage, to the SMIS proxy via the SMIS service. That proxy will give us information about the underlying array. In the NetApp case, we're actually getting block and file. So what you see here on the first line is the array computer system, the pools. There's 3 pools in there. It only shows partial 1. The pools that are underneath that. Second is the file server, or the NAS device. And from there, you've got a list of shares. So this list is only to tell you what is actually discovered from a level 1 discovery. So then admin goes in and says, you know what, I want to manage some of this environment, some of that, either the block side or the share side or the file server side. So the customer can, what we have today, if you take this piece out, they can select which pools they want to manage. By bringing a pool under management, we're actually going to go off and do a second level of discovery and bring in all the LUNs, masking sets, and all the associations that go with the hardware ID, target endpoint, and everything else to give you masking unmasking capabilities. From the file server side, we're basically saying, of all the shares that are available on that NAS device, I want to manage one, some, or all. And so that actually gives us the ability for a managed share, we can actually assign that to a host or a cluster. So only for managed shares will we do this operation of actually modifying ACLs. So you could have 1,000 shares, you could have user shares, a bunch of things that we might not need to care about. And so you get to pick the shares that are actually going to be used for Hyper-V and the ones that we should actually manage an ACL on. UI is going to give you a summary, and then the equivalent of these operations from a CLI perspective is that after we've done discovery, the first line is that it gets you you can get an object called storage array. Then you can get all the pools. We'll have another object called storage file server. Let's see if I can have that here. So this next commandlet is get ASC storage file server. Since we've already done level 1 discovery, this is already in our database. We've already built all the associations, and then we've got objects for these that you can then retrieve with a commandlet. So once you have the file server, we also have a list of shares. So you get to pick, since this is the UI generating this screenshot, it's called ViewScript in our UI in the top right. It knows the IDs. Customer can go in and use names or actually iterate through the objects themselves. They can get a full object. In this case, we're doing the get storage file share by ID, adding it to the array, and then bringing it under management means that we will use we'll pass it into the file server object, set file server, and then add file shares to management. So that's the equivalent of what we've just done in the UI. Once that happens, the customer will be able to see file servers, and then listed under each file server, they'll be able to see shares. And what isn't represented in this, it's over here. We still show all the shares, but we tell you which are managed. And from a management perspective, I don't think we have the assignment. Well, we have the properties. You can say which ones are managed or not managed. Once you have the pools under management, we can also go off and create shares. So this is another level of work that Alex has been engaging with the partners in making sure that we can create file shares from pools. And so that's why you have these settings here. Really, we're just looking at the pool and capacity. And so in our UI today, you can only create a share per pool. If you wanted to create nested shares, that wouldn't be part of our UI. The last piece that I don't have here is the assignment of a share to a cluster or host. Basically, we have, see if I can show it here. On the top left, where it says servers, this is our fabric. So servers, networking, compute. We've got the ability to list all of our standalone hosting clusters. Customer can right-click, properties, go to storage, and then pick the share they want ACLed to this cluster. From our workflow perspective, we'll go off and add all the relevant, all the ACL. We'll do all the ACL management for that share. Finally, fiber channel switches and discovery and provisioning of zones. So, from a pass-through perspective, that's the right-hand side of this picture. It's another way of representing that diagram I showed before. The value add that Windows Server brings from an SMA API perspective is the ability to expose core block storage management via WMI, PowerShell, and REST endpoints. There's an IIS extension that's native in Windows, loaded. You have to pass it a schema, and you get OData REST interfaces. In the pass-through case, this pass-through API, an example of that here. So an example of that pass-through API is basically there's a SIM commandlets that allow us to go one level deeper into the provider. We don't, the caller needs to know SIM. They need to know what they're looking for. So obviously it requires one more advanced level of understanding of what's underneath. Obviously partners can create a WMI V2 provider that abstracts a lot of these complexities for an end user if you want to do something special or something specific to your devices. From our perspective, this is exactly the same APIs we're using to get to the file servers and get to the fiber channel devices. So in this particular case, I'm basically going to set up a SIM session to my provider, HTTP computer name. I've got the namespace, username, password. The namespace here, this secondary namespace, that's the namespace that I'm going to use on the machine calling out. Basically, this namespace is pass-through. Once I create the SIM session, I've got to pass it a class. This particular case, I'm going to use storage volume. This is one I had from TechEd, so I didn't make it file specific. But I'm calling storage volume, so I'm going to get a class. Then I'm going to enumerate instances from that class. Once I've got the enumeration, I can spit out all the properties that come back, and I can go one level deeper and get the enum, and then iterate through each one, and for example, get element name. In this case, it will just return the name for the LUN that's coming from the array. So similar, you can do this for file shares, file servers. Obviously, once you want to traverse associations, it gets a little bit more difficult. But again, that's the work that we've been doing in VMM. This pass-through API gives us access to both SIM-XML and WMI-based providers that sit underneath the SMIS service. But today, the only ones that we've actually exercised using pass-through is SIM-XML. That's for NetApp and EMC.
But the Microsoft ones support WMI, right? The Microsoft providers support the second one, the WMI.
Yes, but those providers that you're talking about don't actually go through the service.
So how would they go?
How would
I mean, how would they?
So the file server UI Actually, you know what? I don't know if the file server team is here. I'm not exactly sure how they're calling out. If they're using the same infrastructure, you wouldn't happen to know. Okay.
I mean, part of what I'm thinking is that if you avoid that mapping, that looks helpful. So, you know, the all Windows case versus Windows mapping to NetApp look different. But no one else besides Windows is doing WMI right now.
Right. So the first question, just to repeat the question, how does a WMI provider for file servers plug into this architecture?
Right.
I'm not exactly sure if they're actually going through this service that's in this diagram that actually goes down and talks to these providers. We've taken this approach using pass-through, right? And I know that from a file server perspective, they're working with the industry on WMI providers that can expose the capabilities that they care about in file server UI. It's file server manager is the other UI. That's the capabilities that would be exposed via WMI or a provider that supports WMI.
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked about how to do that in Samba, but at some point we need to revisit that, Chris and I, and at some point. Anyway, it makes life much easier.
So the second part of that was making life easier. If we remove the association, which piece? These two here?
Yeah. Well, there's a secondary benefit, right, is that this is a subset of file server management. You're doing file server management for a particular application type, virtualization here. The WI provider that gets exercised all the time is the one that ships with Windows 8 and Windows 2012 Server itself. So it's a more used path. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if we get it right, it's going to look more like Windows. It's going to be exercised more reliable, and may have, you know, avoid this this cache and the SMI mapping here.
What we've seen all right. So if we didn't have an association between the SMIS service and the underlying WMI provider, particularly for file servers, then something like the file server UI, that's where the consistent management is what you're talking about. Right, that's got the superset of capabilities that are generic to any application, not VMM and Hyper-V specific. Okay, so in that case, when it comes to the cache, though, the UIs are meant to be, you know, stateless. Right, they're meant to get information in real time. The amount of data that actually goes through VMM actually that's prohibitive, especially for the larger arrays. You look at the Vmax, you look at the NetApps; those could take minutes to discover and get all the information. If we had to do that every time, it would be problematic, right? Unless we did target it, but we don't. We actually get a lot of data because the other piece of value add is the end-to-end discovery. The part that I don't know, if I can't answer right now, is if you create that one WMI provider, does that plug in here and to the file server UI? Is it the same infrastructure that's using them?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, because part of what we have to do is do what is most efficient and also the most synergy. So thinking about it selfishly from the Samba perspective, do the thing that's easiest and most synergistic, and also, you know, provides maximum value. There's a number of features that aren't exposed here that are actually quite useful, that I think are exposed through the WMI provider. And of course, your WMI provider can cache all at once as well. I mean, it can choose to cache the list of systems that are returned, right? For all I know, Windows does that already.
So separate from the file server side, there's another provider model called SMP, and so for block storage. And so you've got some partners implementing that. Each one of them actually has to implement their own cache. There's no shared cache like in the SMIS case. Sorry, this one here. So this SMP actually is a direct implementation of these APIs in the block storage API. And what we've seen is that for performance reasons, these providers have had to implement their own cache to be able to keep up for discovery purposes or anything else. It's not a shared cache like in the SMIS case. Right? So I know Jose has done a lot of work to make sure that the work necessary in the WMI provider implemented on the file server side, on the NAS device side, actually maps to SMIS very well. And so the only piece I need to get an answer for you on is if that same WMI provider is the one that's going to be leveraged both on this SMIS service for VMM and for file server. If that's the case, then it goes back to your seamless and integrated experience where you get to do one provider, gives you full capabilities for the file server side, and gives you the subset of capabilities needed for VMM.
Do you have like a screen flow for, let's take the most common task you could ever do, right? I mean, here I am sitting with a Windows DVD, right? So I'd love to mount to a share and maybe make a snapshot or maybe make a copy of one of your images and launch it. So I just want to mount to a share, make a copy, some snapshot of what you provided me, maybe copy that thing, make a snapshot, and then launch it. Where in this picture would something like that be? I want to take a snapshot and launch a new VM based on that snapshot.
So except for the mounting part, none of that would be here, right? This particular architecture. So the question is, if you wanted to, oh, that's already on the microphone. This API is specific to storage. The VM part of it, VM snapshot, VM management, power on, power off, create, delete, all that is done in a separate API in Windows. Those are the Hyper-V APIs. And so to bridge this together, what we don't have to mount, let's say, like an ISO, right? There's no API available here to mount an ISO that we use. We basically would attach an ISO to a VM, power on the VM, and then you get to install your OS. But how you get that ISO into the environment would not be through these APIs either, right? You would have a file share that you would present that ISO to. In the VMM case, if let's say VMM is the one deploying the VM, there's a library share, there's a library server. That library server is where you would actually drop the payload and say, okay, this is the ISO I want attached to my VM. When you deploy your VM, we'll go off and copy that ISO to whatever location where you want that VM. It could be a file share. So it could be whack file server share 1 / VM01. That folder will contain the configuration, the VHD for the OS, and the ISO that you already have on the file server side will copy it over to that location. Turn on the VM, launch it, and then it'll start loading up Windows from the ISO, and then you can click through.
And for the similar case where you have a VXD, you've got some provisioned already running image. You want to take a snapshot of it for backup purposes. That's separate. That's just
This is the snapshot on the Hyper-V side or snapshot on the VSS remote VSS side?
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter. From the point of view of a user, I've got a running VM. It's critical. I need to make a backup of this running VM, and maybe I have to have it for disaster recovery purposes. Okay. And I'm taking a snapshot of this running VM. And so the reason that this isn't exactly a file system operation, of course, is that you've got to maybe pause the VM long enough while you're doing it, or maybe there's some copy on write magic that goes on inside the Hyper-V. But this API obviously deals with storage, and we're talking about a storage operation here, making a backup, snapshot of a running image. And does that tie into this picture at all?
No. So the answer is no. It does not make it into this picture. So, for example, if we're talking about a Windows file server, where you can do a remote VSS call, so you're going to take a backup. So this is Data Protection Manager, another component in the System Center that's going to say, I need to back up this environment. This particular VM is important to me, so I'm going to have a 15-minute backup schedule. Every time a backup goes into that Hyper-V host and says, I need to back you up, that VSS call does two things. It quiesces all the I/O in the VM. That's VSS magic traversing into the VM, say, pause all I/O, I'm about to take a snapshot. Second, the remote VSS call goes out to the file server and says, I need you to make a remote backup of this VM, basically the VHD in this case, right? And so all that is coordinated. Once that's done, the VM continues going through its normal paces, no downtime. Then DPM will know about the remote backup for that VM, and then it could recover it on a host or do whatever you need to do, or you just keep the backup going. but the VSS APIs are a separate API from any of the work here. I'm not sure how that maps to a non-Windows device, and how I don't think there's a remote VSS equivalent.
It may not matter though, because if you quiesce it, if the VSS stuff works on Hyper-V, then the mounted server is just getting SMB3 calls to make the copy. So it doesn't look any different than any other file.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah,
Right, because
so,
Hyper-V is
I mean,
taken care
It
of.
may just work to NetApp. It just may work to Samba already, simply because they're going to do file operation to make that snapshot. So what I was worried about was that there was some new SMI parallel path that you have to support to actually get that function to work, which is obviously critical.
Right. Yeah. So there are no paths for backup in this case. Backup and recovery are not part of this API. Okay. So from a provider support perspective, we're obviously working with NetApp and EMC on the NAS implementations, working through SMIS and SimXML. These are the list of providers all up that we have with SMIS. And so we know of other partners that are looking into having SMIS provider as part of their block storage, their block array. And there's other partners that are doing new providers as well. That goes back to the guidance. But this is the list we have today for SMIS. And so, but I think that the next level of discussion is as to what this world looks like with a WMI provider coming from an implementation from somebody in the room. Obviously, there's a lot of questions that will come out of that, and we don't have any experience with them, so it's just a matter of understanding what that architecture looks like. What we have working with NAS, with NetApp and EMC is end-to-end discovery, mapping, provisioning, and ACL management, primarily through prototypes for the ACL part. That development work will take some time. All right. For SMI activity, the next Plugfest is August 6th through the 9th. We'll continue to work on NAS at that Plugfest, and actually it's going to be held here in Redmond in Building 25 at the EEC. So that's actually right next door. And so that's August 6th through the 9th. And we've submitted some sessions to STC. So I don't know when they're going to come up with that list, but hopefully we'll be there presenting. We'll also have a system setter set up for interop as well. Since there's obviously a big SMB Plugfest that's part of STC. Actually, I didn't put STC, did I? No. So that second line should be STC, SMIS, CIFS, SMB3 Plugfest. As far as availability of different products, obviously release candidate is out. That's available today. System Center CTP2 was released on Friday. That doesn't have any of the NAS implementation or the NAS work. The NAS actually support is under development, and you can contact me directly. And if you're part of the TAP program, then we can give you interim jobs as they're available. If not, if you're not part of the TAP, then maybe we can work through this, get you on a TAP, get you early access to those builds. But if you know the Windows development cycle or release cycle, it's actually very accelerated. And so there won't be too much lag in between VMM releases. So we have CTP2 that matches release candidate. We'll have a beta that matches with RTM of Windows Server 2012, and it will follow on with our own RTM. And that's it. So I really appreciate the time. Thank you for letting us talk to you guys. And any questions, you've got my email here. We're here for a few more minutes if anything pressing. Otherwise, I'd look forward to talking to you guys individually tonight or tomorrow. Thank you.